For your ears only for the week of May 19th, I'm David Alpern.
I'm Melissa Exelberth.
It put the American people at risk. And trying to determine who was responsible for that, I think, required very aggressive action.
In an email dated September 14th at 7:39 p.m., State Department spokeswoman Victoria Nuland wrote, "Why do we want the Hill, as in Congress fingering Anzal al-Sharia, when we aren't doing that ourselves?" And the penultimate point could be abused to beat the State Department for not paying attention to agency warnings.
Today, Secretary Lew took the first step by requesting and accepting the resignation of the acting commissioner of the IRS.
My question isn't about who's going to resign. My question is, who's going to jail over this scandal?
At times last week, it seemed the Obama administration just couldn't find enough feet to shoot itself in. Attorney General Eric Holder was belabored for the secret subpoena of Associated Press phone call data after the wire service had cooperated by temporarily holding the story of a terror attack forestalled. State Department spokesman Victoria Nuland's defensive email after the fatal attack on U.S. facilities in Benghazi urged no mention of terrorist suspects and prior CIA warnings. And the president's sacking of the acting IRS commissioner was not enough for House Speaker John Boehner after disclosure that groups with the words Tea Party and Patriot in their names were subject to improper scrutiny when they applied for tax-deductible status as social welfare organizations.
Continuing focus on sex abuse in the military and the capture of an alleged CIA spy at the embassy in Moscow also helped distract from some significant good news: the budget deficit shrinking faster than expected, and bipartisan progress on immigration reform in both the House and Senate. To consider these and related political developments, we're joined again by Craig Shirley, Republican public affairs consultant, historian, and Ronald Reagan biographer. His books include Reagan's Revolution, Rendezvous with Destiny, and December 1941. Welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Melissa.
You noted last week that it was pretty unusual for folks to feel both victimized and vindicated. So for the Tea Party, was the IRS scandal a dream or a nightmare come true?
Well, I'm not sure it's either, except it is confirmation that what they, as individuals around the country, individual groups and Tea Party organizations suspected, has been proven correct by the Inspector General's report that came out of the IRS, which included the fact that over a 24-month period, not one Tea Party group was approved for tax-exempt status at the same time when dozens, if not hundreds, of progressive and liberal groups were approved. So it confirmed the suspicion that they'd had all along, was that there was an institutional bias, at least in the IRS, against conservative groups.
By contrast, you say some establishment Republican groups might have reason to be embarrassed. Talk about that, and some GOP leaders warning Obama critics not to overreach.
Well, isn't that interesting, David? Is that not American Crossroads or any of the other Republican establishment political organizations that are based in Washington were apparently met any resistance from approval by the IRS, and it points to the schism between the existing ongoing schism between the Republican Party and the insiders and the outsiders, the Tea Party populist conservatives, and I think that it suggests two things. One is that the people at the IRS and the Washington establishment perceive the national Republicans as being a part of the establishment and therefore one of their kin. Secondarily, it suggests that they don't perceive them as a threat to the status quo in the way they perceive the the Tea Parties as a threat to the status quo. So, in either context, it's bad news for the national Republicans.
Not to deny the political deaf ear of IRS personnel involved, at the very least, would you agree they were not out looking for Tea Party groups, but actually responding to a flood of applications for special tax-deductible status from political activists claiming to qualify as social welfare operations not required to disclose their donors?
Well, yes, they were they weren't on they didn't go out and actively search out Tea Party groups around the country. I mean, you have to go through this process of application for tax exempt status. But the designation of socially active groups is not one that was chosen by the Tea Party, organizations or by the conservatives or anything else. That's a designation that came from Congress and the IRS itself. And so the definition and the interpretation and how much constitutes complete or partial, that all came from the insiders, and that came from Washington. And the Tea Party applicants were simply abiding by the process and the approval process that everybody else was abiding by. So, however you look at this, it comes back to the systemic problems inside the IRS and the Washington establishment as a whole.
Whatever motivation is ultimately proved, do you think Congress should finally clarify the tax law on types and levels of political activity still qualifying for tax-deductible status?
Yes, and I think this is a marvelous political opportunity for President Obama. He and leaders in the Republican Party could jump forward by simply saying, the IRS is just too antiquated, it's too burdened by controversy, it's lost too much of its credibility, and we need to redo the entire tax code and eliminate the IRS and institute a fair, flat tax for all Americans that kicks in at a certain level, doesn't adversely affect those at the lower wage scales, that kicks in at a middle and upper middle class, eliminate most, if not all, deductions, and simplify the tax code so that you don't have to have expensive accountants and thousands of bureaucrats that are going to be tempted to play with power and to play with applicants and things like that.
On the secret Justice Department subpoena, did you sense that some conservatives were a bit uncomfortable defending the free press, the mainstream free press that they usually see as the enemy?
No, I don't think so. I think that the First Amendment is for everybody, and especially in the 21st century with the internet and with podcasts and with all the other means of that individuals have. David, of expressing themselves.
What about the press shield legislation that President Obama has asked to be reintroduced? Do you think there'll be bipartisan support for that?
I think there will, Melissa, but I want to look at it closer, but I have my reservations about it. I don't like the idea, first of all, who is to decide who is press and who is not, especially as we just discussed the expansion of communication with new technologies. So who is to say who is a journalist and who is not a journalist? And I don't like the idea of creating a special, segregated, protected class of journalists that can do and say things that the rest of us can't do or say. So I think we have to look at that very carefully.
A last question. Despite some false quotations suggesting White House interference on the Benghazi talking points, there does seem to be evidence of State Department damage control going beyond what the CIA and the FBI thought necessary. Do you see that becoming a future problem for the Secretary of State at that time, Hillary Clinton, if she runs for president again?
All right, David, 3 years is such a long time. And to illustrate it is that when she was up for confirmation as Secretary of State, is that none of the problems that had visited her and President Clinton during their 8 years in the White House really came back to bite her.
Craig Shirley is a Republican consultant, historian, and Ronald Reagan biographer. His books include Reagan's Revolution, Rendezvous with Destiny, and December 1941.
Quote from the news, the biggest assault on the 40-hour work week in this country in a generation. That was Indiana's freshman Republican Congressman Luke Messer arguing that Obamacare should be repealed because it's forcing employers to cut work shifts in anticipation of new costs. The GOP House majority agreed. Its 37th vote to repeal, but no Senate action is expected.
Next, democracy and danger in Pakistan, for your ears only.